brief housekeeping announcements to go through first, though. During today's session, we will be taking photos via screenshots. So if you don't wish to have your image captured, that's fine. Please just keep your video off. If you could also keep your microphones muted, we'd appreciate that. We don't anticipate there'll be many problems with regard to conduct, but we just remind people to keep the chat friendly and courteous. And at the end, when we have our Q&A session, we just invite you to type your questions into the chat and I'll ask Gabbie your question on your behalf. Before we get started, Auntie Pam Peterson is a valued member of our committee, but she's unable to make it today. She did, however, wish to welcome you to country with the following video.
It is my pleasure to do the welcome to country on this beautiful land of ours with our lovely pastures and the Dungala River, which you all may know as the Murray River, and the surrounding of many, many gum trees, and of course, the people. I would now like to acknowledge the traditional owners of our lands on which we stand, and I pay my respect to our elders, past, present, and emerging. Thank you to Voices for Nicholls for all of your efforts so far. I hope everyone in the Nicholls electorate is encouraged to join a kitchen table conversation for a yarn sometime over the next few months. Thank you.
I would now like to introduce our interviewer, Fiona Smolinars. Fiona grew up in Gippsland in a dry land and then irrigated farm. She studied agriculture and moved to Northern Victoria for her first job and has stayed ever since. She started her career as an animal nutritionist and from there has had a variety of roles related to facilitating conversations and managing community projects. Fiona has built up her own business with roles such as professional facilitator, one of which included being facilitator for the Fairley Community Leadership Program, an event manager, a volunteer manager, including work with the Lighthouse Project, and is currently the community connector, which offers a concierge service for professionals who are relocating to our region. Outside of work, Fiona is active in the community with her last role as chair of the Shepparton Arts Festival. We are very privileged to have Fiona working with us today, and I would now like to hand over to her.
Beautiful. Thanks very much, Rob. I'd like to start this interviewing acknowledging that this is actually the first time I've ever had to got the privilege to interview. So I'm pretty excited that I get to start my career with Gabbie Chan. For those that don't know about Gabbie, she's been a journalist for 30 years, the last 8 years being a political journalist with The Guardian. She's written and edited a number of books, some history books, biographies, and even a recipe book. She is the daughter of Singaporean parents, and in 1996, she moved from the Canberra Press Gallery to marry a sheep and wheat farmer. In 2017, she wrote Rusted Off, which was a commentary about the gap between city and country and how to bridge it. And today we're really privileged for her to be here to talk about her new book, Why Give a Fuck About Farming. So thank you, Gabbie, for joining us. And my first question is, so what was your initial motivation or the spark to write this book?
Well, thanks, Fiona. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Auntie Pam too. I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people, the land on which I am sitting today. I've learnt a lot from them, and I wrote about that in Rusted Off. But I guess the spark for this book came as a seed in Rusted Off, and there was one chapter in Rusted Off that I devoted to agriculture, and I covered just three aspects that I think was changing the politics of what I was reporting on, and that was climate change, land usage, and some of the regulations and rules around farming. And as I covered political debates more and more and watched what was happening, say, in the 2019 election, where independents were getting increasingly making inroads on often quite short lead times, I thought there's something happening around the structure and economics of rural communities that I want to dig into, and that particularly related to agriculture, because it seemed to me that we were facing as a region here, as a nation, and as a globe, these kind of existential problems around climate change, linking into things like water, soil, zoonotic diseases, natural disasters, and farming was heavily exposed to all of those things in a way that I think many other industries aren't quite so exposed. So I really wanted to pull apart this kind of model that has developed for farming and work out, you know, at the heart of it, what it would look like if we looked at it with fresh eyes again. And I thought it would be a relatively contained exercise, but it turned into a very kind of deep, almost philosophical exercise for me, particularly as I was researching as the pandemic hit, as the shelves emptied for short times in supermarkets. And so it really began this whole journey of, you know, an exercise that stripped back everything, I think, to really tin tacks.
So I think about our community here in Northern Victoria. It's really diverse in terms of our urban community, our farming community, and we have a huge ethnically diverse community here. Things have changed a lot from our traditional views of what farming is or who a farmer is. So what should we know about the future of farming?
I think we should know that there is diversity in farming, and there are people that are trying lots of different things in order to get over both the daily hurdles and the longer term existential hurdles that I talked about earlier. But the bottom line to me seems to be that farmers have been told, particularly for the last 30 years, you know, we're going into this kind of deregulated environment. The Hawke-Keating government really kind of kick-started the deregulation moves, and the Howard government really doubled down on that deregulation. And some of that was really good. Some of that cleaned out a lot of the industry. It required more thinking, more innovative thinking, better business practices. But I think in that great arc of reform, somehow I think we might have got to a sweet spot and then gone beyond it. And by that I mean, you know, competition policy has really, it seems to me, brought about less competition. So we know that, is my screen going dark and light?
Yeah, it is a bit, but yeah. That's better.
It seems to me well, competition policy has created less competition. So we know that we have less farm businesses than we had. There were about 200,000 in the 50s. There are about 80,000 now, depending on which figures you take into account. When I was looking at it about 10 years ago, there were about 120,000. So those numbers are changing markedly. We know that there is, from food academics, there is this hourglass shape in farming. So that on the one hand, there's many producers. On the other hand, there are many eaters. And in the middle is an increasingly concentrated wasted sort of area, which is dominated by some very big food companies, some very big retailers, some very big supermarkets. And so it's created, I think, a kind of economic story that means, there are price signals sent to farmers, and that is the only way that you can improve or get a pay rise is to improve your yield. So produce more, but it doesn't take into account any of the other signals. It doesn't take into account the environmental signals that you might be getting on your land, the climate signals that you might be getting, the changes in rainfall patterns. So all of these things is a dance, I think, for farmers and land managers generally. And so I think it's time, the conclusion I came to was that I think it's time to reassess this and think about what we want longer term in terms of land management, and work out other ways to send signals to farmers about what we want in terms of land management, in terms of food production, and in terms of the health of food.
So thinking about that, we've got a lot of big issues, a lot of complex issues, which you just mentioned. I've noticed that the NFF and Farmers for Climate Change are coming out very strong about climate change regulations. So what are the opportunities for regions like ours to work with partner organisations?
Everyone's trying to find a way to land this. There are some good impulses, including, amongst the federal government. David Littleproud is looking at a carbon plus biodiversity pilot program right now that would see land managers and farmers, and I include in farmers, Indigenous farmers, Indigenous land managers, very important part of the equation. But so there are these programs now, bits and pieces of programs that are looking at ways to provide other income streams for farmers, so they're not having to, make cheap food cheaper all the time in order to get a pay rise. So those things are happening. The other big thing that's happening is the private markets that are opening up. And already we've seen Microsoft and its $1 billion climate fund. Microsoft, if anyone missed it, is looking to ameliorate or account for all emissions from the time the company started. I think it was back in the 70s. So they've got this big bucket of money that they're looking to pay all sorts of people to reduce emissions. And they've already started paying a couple of farmers in Australia. Ironically, Rupert Murdoch's Cavan Station down near Yass, a place called Wilmot Station up in Ebor, also related to Rupert Murdoch, Alistair McLeod, MacDoc, and paying them for soil carbon, for increasing soil carbon. So these private markets, I think, are going to become more and more of the story. But the other part of it, I think, that particularly relates to local communities is we're seeing the development now, and there's one happening through a bloke called Andrew Ward, who is a regenerative farmer, and they're trying to get together a co-op in the old-fashioned sense of the word. So there's a lot of, in the private market, part of the big problem for farmers and land managers is just negotiating these incredibly complex carbon agreements at the end of the day, where they're doing everything else on the farm, right? So how this plays out, no one knows yet. And so there's a lot of reticence in the industry, because unless you've got the resources of, say, a carbon desk, or you've got some money to pay some pretty knowledgeable people how this is going to play out, it's really hard to think about going into a contract that may lock up your land or change the way you practice your business for maybe 25 years. So this thing that Andrew Ward is looking at is a co-op where, the group of farmers or land managers share the cost of the expertise that's required to negotiate carbon agreements it gives them a measure of safety. It gives them access to expertise they wouldn't normally have. And it also gives them as a group, it replicates the scale that bigger properties already have. So that advantage of scale is given to the smaller number of farmers. Now, this is kind of, in a sense, it's a kind of back to the future thing. We used to have a lot of co-ops in farming, and they fell by the wayside with the deregulation agenda. And now people are thinking, maybe we could all get together and we would get some safety in numbers, you know, like basic herd principles. And I think it's a really interesting development because in a sense, it cuts out the middleman. It cuts out the commissioning agent, or it makes it a whole lot cheaper for people to enter into those things. So how they roll out, I think, has somewhere there's a piece for community groups like yours to get on board with those and look at how that contracts like that or reforms like that changes land management in a particular locality or region, how you can work in with them to maybe meet some of the own priorities that your group might have. I don't know what your priorities are, but most of the groups that I talk to have a sort of top 5 of what their priorities are they want to achieve and see in their areas, and that could be something I think that community groups could really plug into with local landholders.
That's fabulous opportunities, isn't it?
Yeah. And this stuff is changing so quickly. Like, I finished this manuscript when the book came out on the 31st of August, and I finished the manuscript probably finally about June, and it's even moved on since then. This stuff is happening so quickly. The Business Council of Australia's report this weekend, I haven't read it yet, but that certainly is a reflection of how quickly the market is moving globally. And I think we're going to see a very different picture, by 2030, let alone 2050.
So thinking about that, and there's been a lot of research done about climate change, about soil management, about water policy. How does that remain relevant and useful going into the future?
Sorry, how does the...
all the research that's gone on to get to this point right now, how does that not sit in the bottom drawer and get sort of left aside?
Yeah, I think
with things happening, things moving so quickly.
Yeah. I found a lot of amazing reports that have been written already in government drawers that had not been moved on. The National Outlook report is one of those by Ken Henry and David Thodey, and that really looks at where the new industries are going to be and names land as one of 5 key areas that we should be reimagining, that we should be thinking about how we're going to manage land. And there's a food resilience report that Stephen Bartos, who was a senior federal public servant, a senior state public servant, and looked at after the Queensland floods, when a lot of the distribution of food was a problem because the floods cut off access to many communities. He's written this whole report. He foresaw threats like dual threats, where it's not just flood, but it might be flood and bushfire, it might be flood and pandemic, it might be bushfire and pandemic. Written in 2012, lo and behold, we get to 2020 and it's fire, flood, plague, pandemic. And so there's all this work that's been done sitting in bottom drawers. And I think revisiting those reports rather than continuing to commission constant new reports, a bit like, it reminds me of the Murray-Darling Basin. There is something, I think at the last count, the figures were something like 40-something reports on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan in the last decade or so. And, you know, they make recommendations. And if you could synthesize those recommendations and say, don't commission any more reports, just go with the most common recommendations that all of this vast body of experts have recommended, and you would feel like you were getting somewhere. But I think, you know, the political process seems stuck in this cycle of refusing to acknowledge that one side of politics might do a couple of good things. And so we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater every time we change governments. And I think that that's a big problem. I think that this kind of personality politics that's driving things, rather than, you know, the policy detail and what is it that we need in order to solve some of the challenges we have.
So how do we change to that new way of being, to have a longer term focus and not have the party politics? And how do we use those research reports and get those recommendations and actually follow them through?
Well, I mean, we have, you know, this parliament, which is a democracy. We have, I think, the greater competition that there is for the 150 seats in the lower house and the seats in the Senate. I think the greater competition we have is the better off we are. You know, we're always spruiking that markets can fix everything. So competition, if competition is the mantra, let's have a bit of political competition for a start. And I think the thing that I've seen in the last decade, particularly with the MPs on the crossbenches, is this greater propensity for independents or minor parties to start putting up reforms. So not waiting for governments to write policy, actually drafting legislation. We've seen that happen, you know, with Helen Haynes, for example, on the ICAC, what an ICAC bill might look like. We've seen it happen on energy, I think, as well. Marriage equality started as a reform from the outside of Parliament and really pushed inwards into the Parliament, and as a way of reform. I think it was a really effective way of reforming things. And, you know, in the probably up to the 80s, you would think that you wouldn't get such a mass connection of people to muster the forces to pressure MPs on such a big issue, such a big social issue, and yet it happened. So I think that we often hear about the downside of social media. I think social media has great disadvantages and great advantages, and that is connecting people, like-minded people, and allowing these sorts of reforms to happen. So all of the reports I accessed for the book were all public reports. No one dropped me anything secret, no classified documents. They're all sitting out there in the public domain. They're all sitting in website archives for great policy institutes that we've killed over the last decade or two. You know, Land and Water Australia, the National Climate Change Research Facility that was strictly dedicated to how to synthesize some of that policy in different ministry and department areas around how we face the challenges of climate change. This stuff is all out there. So I think the power of community groups is to connect some of those dots. And if people are unhappy with what governments are doing, and oppositions as well, they actually sit down and get some sort of a draft or an idea or an alternative to say, you know, not just, I'm not happy with where you're landing that policy or the fact that you haven't designed a policy. What about this policy? Take it and run with it. And in a sense, that's why I'm so obsessed about writing these books, is because, you know, you've got to put up alternatives if you think the system isn't working in some areas. And so that's what I try to do with the books, just throw it all out there and say, hey, what about this? Have you thought about this? You know, I'm just a journo. I don't think it's the domain of any particular expertise. I think it's just the domain of engaged community citizens.
And that's a fabulous lead in for my next question. You know, everyone's busy, everyone's tired. These are complex issues that don't have quick fixes. How do we, and I also think about, you know, our community here being ethnically diverse, and a lot of people are dealing with very day-to-day issues about, you know, being a refugee here and things like that. How do we bring everyone up to speed or on the journey so that they can confidently have their say in shaping the future of farming, and particularly where their food comes from and how much do they pay, and for it being fair and equitable for farmers as well?
I think there are two levels to this. So there's the community level and the government level. And the government level is obviously, I think one of the things that I learned out of Rusted Off was, and the interviews I did in that, was that community can do a lot, but they can't do everything. You know, government is responsible for this framework, for trade agreements, for all of these, the architecture of the way we operate as businesses, as citizens, as organisations. And so there is a big piece of the puzzle that I would like to see there around a return to some sort of national food policy, whatever our representatives or our community groups or concerned citizens think that should be. And personally, I think it should be a kind of land usage policy that looks at the whole of Australia, thinks about more strategically about where our prime food growing land is, thinks about you know, where the projects will be that the market is driving, like carbon plantings, all of that sort of changes that are coming down the track. But at the community layer, I think for me, particularly in pandemic, it was about reconnecting with people around my area who were growing food, rather than just simply relying on the big supermarkets to do all of it. And I know that's happened around here. We're seeing much more confidence, I think, in food producers bringing their own goods to market, to a shorter chain market, because in talking to people for the book, there were a lot of smaller growers, smaller bakers, smaller food producers of all types that were run over when the supermarket shelves emptied, because people were forced to get on board with the idea that you might not be able to get every single thing that you want from your big duopoly supermarket or even your IGA. You know, I ended up buying flour, would you believe, from the chemist, and I was horrified when the bag turned up and it was covered in German, and we're wheat growers. I need a home mill. You know, it's like my separation of, as a kid, you know, food comes from the supermarket, and I live on a farm. How is it that we're so used to that kind of mindset, I think? And there's some good, again, another good report that's been done on supply chain food resilience, and that is this idea. It was done by Professor Andrew Campbell for the Australian Conservation Foundation, but it was about not just relying on big, long global supply chains, which we will still need to grow food in Australia, but also thinking about local and regional supply chains. So how is it that you can have all of these strings to your bow so that the next time a big pandemic arrives, that you're not relying on only one supply chain, that you have some resilience in the system?
And so how does that impact on people who live in large metro areas where they probably don't have access to the local baker or the local market gardener and things like that?
Well, we don't have a local farmers market here, but I know lots of Sydney suburbs that have farmers markets because food producers go in. They know they've got a certain population that they can rely on. And so I think it's actually happening in city suburbs as well, where you might have a local farmers market, you might have a local community garden where they're starting to grow veggies. I know that's happening where we visit down on the south coast, which is basically a suburban area. Lots of city communities, I think, are starting to take this on, and then there's a lot of businesses. One of the businesses I interviewed for the book was Feather and Bone Butchery, where they access, they buy their meat, they buy whole animals, they sell tip to tail cuts, and they buy them from food producers that they get to know, they like their systems, and they sell them at a premium. So, I think there's all sorts of models out there that are starting not just in regional and rural communities, but really city communities where they've got the weight of numbers to, as a food producer, you turn up, you're probably going to sell all your stuff. Whereas you turn up, as I said, we don't have a farmers market here. We have them a little bit further afield, but certainly not in the local region. And we're a region full of farmers.
Yeah. So we've talked a bit about community. So what should we expect of our political leaders in this space?
More engagement, I think. More engagement, a little more independence of thinking, even if they're in a political party. And that requires a little bit of leeway from journalists like me to say that, so that everyone doesn't have to be spouting the same line, that there is a competition of ideas in political parties. So I think the political parties have for so long dominated Australian democracy, and it's not just here. Many different democracies are two-party systems or three-party systems. I would like to see a little more diversity of thought and a little more engagement and a little bit, dare I say it, more bipartisanship on some issues. I don't think we're going to get anywhere on climate change unless we have some sort of bipartisanship. If we're going on the last decade and a half of climate wars in Australian politics, so a bit more engagement, a little less point scoring.
So my last question. So in summary, why should we give a fuck about farming?
Because farming is at the intersection of all of the world's problems, big problems: climate change, soil loss, water shortages, pandemic diseases, zoonotic diseases. These things are going to touch on farming and touch on food production. And the way that we use land is going to be pivotal as not only Australian government, but all governments go forward. Most of the governments I looked at around the world in the research for the book were trying to think of this. The UK government, a Conservative government under Boris Johnson, big culture warrior, they're looking at how they can pivot out of Brexit, away from the Common Agricultural Policy, which is straight out production subsidies, into environmental services, into a way of measuring and verifying land usage. And I think land and its management and the food that is grown on land will be at the centrepiece of every single government's climate policy. I might not agree with them all on it, but I think, it's time to think. You can't think of farming anymore as this kind of little remote cottage industry that only affects a small part of our GDP, therefore we don't need to care about it. It actually is going to be pivotal to how we solve the world's problems going forward.
Okay, and one last question. What are your thoughts of the role of media?
Media is obviously pivotal to public debate in across the world. The interesting thing for me is I've just started as The Guardian's rural and regional editor, in charge of a project called the Rural Network. And I had come from 20-something years of political reporting in a very kind of hothouse environment in the state, New South Wales Press Gallery, and then the Canberra Press Gallery. And the reason that I sort of peeled off of that type of reporting to write Rusted Off was because I felt the divide, I lived the divide between rural and regional places and the Press Gallery, and I thought there's got to be a better way to report. I'm not saying Press Gallery reporting is not important. It's really important to hold politicians accountable. It's really important to tell truth to power. But I felt, given my particular view of the world, that is where I lived in a town of 2,000. It's really important for me to tell the story of politics and community from the outside of the Parliament. So in this role as editor of the Rural Network, I wanted to reimagine a way of rural coverage that had either been dominated by the infrastructure model, which is the ABC model, which, is really important, absolutely integral to Australia, I think, as a democracy and a society, but also the model of reporters who are rural reporters based in metropolitan areas. And the Rural Network essentially reimagines that by finding local people to report from their areas and tell us what the big issues are to them that are impacting on their communities. It kind of tips the model, the media model, rather than me saying, I think this is an important issue in your community of Shep or wherever you are. Someone from there saying to me, hey, this is a really big issue for us, whether it's whatever it is, the Inland Rail, whatever, water shortages, doesn't matter. And so I think the media is slowly changing, or certainly the people around me are starting to think, and this really came from Lenore Taylor, our editor-in-chief of The Guardian. How is it that we can do this in a media model that has been filleted of its revenue sources from advertising by Facebook, by Google, by Apple News? How is it that we can tell these stories, keep telling these stories in a way that honours the communities, in a way that doesn't send someone in from the city for 2 days to the main street of Shepparton to decide what the story is? And I think that is the future of media, and that's, that engagement. It's a bit like politicians engaging more, requiring them, representatives to engage more. I think we need to require media to engage more and listen, rather than, the bobblehead media model where you get an advocate from a farming organisation, you get an advocate from a mining organisation, and that's supposed to represent the great diversity that's out there in all of our towns and communities. I think more voices, more engagement with communities is really what I would love to see more in Australian media.
Well, that excites me. So thank you very much for your passion, for your drive to open our eyes, to provide some important information and questions for us to ponder as regional and rural communities. The great thing is that this is recorded, so if you need to look back and connect in with all those reports that you talked about, that's going to be really useful for everybody who's listening in today. So thank you very much.
Pleasure.
So we'll stop the recording now, and Rob steers